Okay, debaters, this video is going to be a little longer today because we're just going to go through and talk about all the different evidence and arguments for the disadvantage. So, first part is an explanation. If you haven't read this explanation on the first page of the negative side's arguments, you really should read it. It's super important. First part of the disadvantage, remember, is uniqueness. Uniqueness tells us what the world is like today. So the story of this disadvantage is that right now there's balance between the national and state governments. And then the link, how things change, is that passing the plan is going to take that balance between the states and the national government, and the national government is going to become too strong, going to become too powerful. Then the impact is going to be that states having power is good, and the national government having power is bad, right? So really simple story. Things are balanced now. AF causes an imbalance. That imbalance is bad. So this evidence is going to help us tell that story by giving us those pieces, right? So the first piece is we need to look at the uniqueness. And the uniqueness is that the balance of power is even right now. So first we have this piece of evidence from Purnell, 2019. 2019, not bad, only a year or two old. And it says they're working together right now. And this talks a lot about President Trump, who at the time of this recording of this video is still president, but in the near future won't be president anymore. But that doesn't really matter. The point of this piece of evidence is to show that the way the government has worked in the last few years has been that there's been balance between the national government and the states. So there's no reason to believe that that balance will get out of whack anytime soon, right? So this talks a lot about the president, maybe former president by the time you're watching this video, and also the idea of, the Republicans and politicians at the national level believing that there should be a balance of power between the states. So this is a good piece of uniqueness evidence in the sense that it sets up the argument that there's a good balance between the states right now. It's not so good of a piece in the sense that it's a little bit older and it has the previous president as the focus of the argument, right? Okay, the next one is from Jennifer Selin in 2020. It says that the response to the coronavirus proves that the tension between state and national power is balanced right now. And you might see this word federal sometimes. Federal just means national power, right? So federal government is the national government. This one's really good because it talks about, the Constitution. It talks about, the history of the United States, and it talks about how things are actually happening right now. And it says that the national government has helped battle COVID, but it hasn't overstepped its bounds, right? So it's doing its job, it's helping out the states, but it's not taking power away from them, right? It's helping them in an appropriate way. It's a pretty long piece of evidence. I would probably highlight it down. If you haven't watched the highlighting video, go take a look at that. The third and I believe final piece, of uniqueness is from Eisen in 2020. This is a really great one because it talks about the criminal justice system, and that's what we want to talk about, right? That's what the whole topic is about. So when we get to the link, if our uniqueness is about the criminal justice system, then the link is going to show how that changes really obviously, right? So this is a really great piece of evidence. If I was reading the disadvantage, I would probably read this piece of evidence as my uniqueness in the 1NC. And basically, Lauren Eisen talks about, when we do criminal justice stuff, what level of government is that done on? Is it done on the national level, the state level, the local level, the city level, or the community level? What level is it done on, right? And she says, based on this data, some 2.2 million people, and then the laws that exist and et cetera, she does a really deep dive on the data. And she basically says that, it's state prisons where a lot of this stuff happens. So it happens at the state level. So this card's really good because it talks about criminal justice. It talks about our topic, which is what we want to say the affirmative changes, right? Because that's what the plan does. It changes the criminal justice system. And it has really good data and evidence and arguments and claims that help make that point. So this is a really great piece of evidence for the 1NC. and I would read it. Okay, so that's the uniqueness. That explains how the world is right now, right? So, for example, this card, Lauren Eisen is not saying that the states should do it, should do criminal justice reform. She's just saying the way it is right now, the states are the ones who do criminal justice reform. That's all she's saying. And we want her to say that so that when you get to the link, you can say that the plan changes that, and then you can say that that change is a bad thing, right? So uniqueness just says, here's how the world works. It's our beginning of the story. Then we get on to the link. So the link we have here, like we talked about already, is that the plan upsets the balance between the national and the state governments. So this Chavis 2011 card, a little bit old, right? 2011, it's a while ago now, maybe 10 years by the time you watch this video. But what's Kami Chavis talking about? They're saying that the plan is a big overreach by the federal government because it impacts all parts of the criminal justice system and the legal system in general. So they sort of talk about like, when we make changes to the criminal justice system, how does that affect all these other pieces? Well, it affects the actual people doing the job. It gives politicians more power to do things, and it shifts the power of how to deal with these issues away from the states and to the federal government. So, and then also in the end, every law is enforced by police, right? So even if a law happens at the local level or the state level or the national level, behind that is the question of who's enforcing that law, right? So even if you pass a local law, if the people enforcing that law have to do it by national standards, then even if it's a local law, it's really a national law, right? Because the governing law of that law is a national law. So this makes the argument that when you have changes to police criminal justice in general, it might start as a small thing, but it impacts so many other things that it can throw the balance of power between states and the national government completely out of whack, right? So it's a little bit older, but that's okay because it's talking about a general principle of what happens, not what happens in the year 2020 or the year 2019 or 2021 or whatever, right? It says in general, this is what happens. So it's okay, that's old. Next piece of evidence from Felbab-Brown is that the affirmative plan crushes the balance of power because police reform is for governments of the states and cities, not the national government. So this one talks about, it talks more about history, it talks about in the Constitution, Article 10 says that anything not in Articles 1 through 9, which is what explicitly says what the national government should do, anything not in 1 through 9 belongs to the states. And guess what? Law enforcement isn't in 1 through 9. So therefore, it's in 10. So therefore, if it's in 10, it belongs to the states and local governments. It talks a little bit more about that, and it talks about, the history of tradition we have. And basically, it says, if the federal government were to take a more active role in law enforcement, enforcing various laws, that would disrupt one of the cornerstones laid out by our Constitution. So really one of the fundamental pieces of our society and our legal system. So obviously that would be a big change from the way things are right now, right? So I think this is a good piece of evidence. It cites some really important work, some important legal documents for our country. And if you can win this piece of evidence, you win a really good link to the affirmative, right? Okay. Third piece of link evidence says that the plan destroys state power because criminal justice reform is a core power of state governments. And that's Mulhauser and Kaniski, I'm not sure about that, in 2019. And this talks about, it's from 2019, so it's not too old. It's like a year and a half old. And talks about all these different things that have been passed in the last few years. And they're mostly changes that have happened at the state and local level. And asks why, this police brutality is a big problem we've had. So why has it been states and local governments that have been making all the responses to this, right? And it says, well, that's a core power of the states and local governments. That's what they do. They respond to this. And whether they've done a good job or a bad job is a different question than whose job is it. And these authors say that, if we're going to have police reforms and other criminal justice reforms, that happens at the state and local level. So therefore, if you have the plan doing it at a national level, that is not in keeping with what we traditionally do. That rearranges the amount of power that each part of the government has, right? Too much for the national, too little for the state government. It's a big overreach. Okay, so that's the uniqueness and link. So we say things are in balance, plan throws things out of balance, but now we have to say, who cares, right? Why should the judge care that the states lose power and the national government gains power? What's the difference? The impact answers that question for us, right? So the impact is going to say that states having power is good. It protects rights and solves problems. So, and remember, what we talked about up here in the link is that the plan changes criminal justice reform, but it also just takes away power generally from the states and gives it to the national government generally. So these aren't necessarily going to be things that relate directly to criminal justice reform. They're going to relate to state versus national power generally, because we're saying generally the power is taken away from the states and given to the national government. So if that's the case from the link and from the uniqueness, then if that balance gets out of whack, why is that bad? That's what we're trying to answer here. So Chavis Gupta, 2019, Harvard Political Review, nice, tries to answer that question. Basically, they say that states and cities, especially more progressive ones, have done a really good job standing up for minority populations. So when you think about things like sanctuary cities, or you think about things like LGBTQIA plus rights, think about social services spending, think about gun control, immigration, et cetera, all this stuff that people on the progressive side of the spectrum tend to think is really good. It's more progressive states, governors, cities that have been doing that stuff, while the national government, especially under like people like President Trump, more Republican presidents, President Bush, didn't really do those things, right? So this argument, this author is making the argument that states having more power is good because they can do more progressive things than the national government can, and they can do them more quickly, right? And it talks about things like racism, sexism, classism, societal problems. Generally, the state and local governments are going to be more responsive to that, and they're going to be more quickly acting to respond to those things. Second impact argument we have in here is that state power is the best way to solve climate change. The tag is a little bit extreme here. It says the only hope we currently have. Okay, you might want to retag that and just say it's the best hope or it's our best option right now. That's from Ibbitson, 2017. And in this article, John Ibbitson basically talks about, you know, the national government the last couple decades, at least, I don't remember who it talks about here, but I know at least from, you know, President Carter, all the way up to the modern era, presidents haven't really done a lot about climate change, right? And we have known about it since the 70s. And of course, it keeps getting more serious every year, but if your goal to combat climate change is just hope you get the right person elected into the presidency, it's not a very good plan, right? We've seen in the past that hasn't really done very much. So John Ibbitson makes the argument that we need to stop relying on the national government because they don't really do that much, and start thinking about what can state governments do. And he talks about all these good things that states have done in the past few years, like 25 states do all this good stuff. States are way ahead of the national standards on cleaning up pollution, having good air, et cetera, et cetera. Shout out to Minnesota in this article. And basically just talking about how the states have been way better than the national government. So the end result of that is that if the states have their power taken away from them, if they're weaker than the national government, then they won't be able to spend as much time or power, or they simply just won't have the power, maybe the legal power, to do these things that they need to do at the local level to make sure that we can help stop climate change, right? And obviously that's very bad. Climate change, if it gets out of control, is going to kill a lot of people and or end the planet. So when you compare that to the affirmative, definitely outweighs, right? Okay, and then the last one, last one we have here is that state power is good for protecting rights and solving problems. And this is from Parlett, William Parlett, 2019. He's a law professor. And he says that loss of state power in one area spills over to other areas. So he talks about examples, Supreme Court examples and other examples from the past, that when states lose power in one area, it doesn't seem like it should affect other areas, right? Like let's say the economy, the environment, healthcare, whatever, just because a state government loses power in that area, why would that affect like criminal justice or education or housing or whatever, right? He says that actually those things do affect each other because the balance of power between the national and state governments affects basically everything, right? And most of these things are so interrelated that even if you change one thing, if you give one piece of power from the state government to the national government, that has connections to a bunch of other things. So the example he uses in here is to talk about a Supreme Court case in 1994, where basically the national government argued that because they have these laws about handguns, that means that they can also regulate schools because you can't have handguns in school zones. Therefore, the national government law impacts the school laws, and the national government should have priority in making educational law. Now, the Supreme Court did strike that down, but that's an example of how this how you can have unforeseen consequences in all these things, right? How about how when you change one area, even a seemingly small area in state law, and give it to the national government, it can affect all these other areas. So like we talked about in one of these pieces of link evidence, if you think about who actually carries out the laws, who enforces the laws, it's the police, right? So when you change how the police do things, it doesn't just impact criminal justice reform, it impacts every law because the police are the ones who are enforcing all these laws, right? So that's a really good example of how those two pieces of evidence work together and how they support one another, right? Because if it's true that when you lose state power in one area, it spills over to other areas where you lose power, then that really makes a strong case about how if you do the affirmative, you are going to lose a bunch of power in the balance of power between the states and national governments, and it's going to end up going from the state governments to the national governments, which is going to cause all these impacts, which are really bad, right? So those are the basic pieces of evidence on the negative side. I think it's maybe not a clear story, but it's, once you break it down to just those three pieces, it's a relatively clear story, right? It just says, right now there's balance. If we do the plan, things will become imbalanced between the state and national governments, and that imbalance is a bad thing. Okay, so that's good. It's going to be easier to go through the AF because it's going to be basically just the opposite. So again, if you're going to the affirmative arguments and you haven't read the explanation at the top, you should definitely read it. Super helpful. But the affirmative answers are basically a mirror image to the negative arguments. So we're going to have uniqueness, link, and impact, and it's going to be in a lot of the same arguments and claims, it's going to be the same stuff, right? So first piece of uniqueness evidence we have here, uniqueness is going to say that the tension between the national and state governments is already imbalanced, right? And when we say it's already imbalanced, that means that it doesn't matter if the affirmative case makes it more imbalanced, right? It's already imbalanced. What's a little more imbalanced? Who cares? So Douglas Berman says that the federal government already overpowers state and local governments as shown by overreach in matters of policing. And basically what Doug Berman says is that there's all these national types of police and that they have priority over local and state police, right? So if it's already the case that they're a national level police and they outrank the state and local police, then the case is not that much of an overreach, right? Because this is already happening in the status quo. So when you say, the beginning of the story, what the affirmative is saying here is that the uniqueness that the negative lays out is not true. The beginning of their story is actually the same as the end of the story. They say the end of the story, that the affirmative is going to say that the end of the disad is that federal overreach is bad, right? National overreach is bad. But this piece of evidence shows that it's already overreached. So who cares? The affirmative doesn't do anything that's not already happening. So I think this is a good piece of evidence. It has some nice examples. It's relatively short, get through it pretty quick. Next piece is Jensen 2015, a little bit old. Uniqueness is not super good for arguments that are a little bit old. And it says that for nearly 50 years, the president has overreached, proving that state power is dead and gone. So this is 4 or 5 years old, but it doesn't actually matter that this evidence is a little bit old, right? Because this is just a historical example of saying, you know what, there is no balance between state and national government. It's already imbalanced. So this is a good argument. It has some really good examples in it. And I think it's going to give good background to those of you who want to debate this type of argument, who want to use uniqueness. The next non-unique argument is that the president's overreach during coronavirus, they mean President Trump, proves that the federal government already overreaches the state and local government power. And this is Joshua Geltzer 2020. So that's good. Nice new piece of evidence. And again, this talks about President Trump, but that's not really the point, right? The point is not that Trump did this. The point is that the federal government has already overreached its power to the states. So if the federal government already overreaches power to the states, why haven't we seen the impact that the negative is talking about? Or if it's true, then why does more overreach that the affirmative plan does, why would that matter? It's just more overreach that already exists. So this has some good examples in it. It's probably a little bit long, but other than that, I think that this makes a good case that the state and national power is already imbalanced. So there's no reason to care too much that the affirmative case imbalances it some more. Okay, so that's all the uniqueness evidence, right? And the affirmatives through the uniqueness evidence is basically just saying there's already overreach now. So even if the link is true and the plan overreaches, who cares? Because it won't cause any more impact or it won't change the way the world is right now. So there's no reason to vote negative on the disad. Okay, let's get into the link answers. So the link answers say, first one is Bains and Mulhauser 2020. It basically says that federal government has the power to require changes from police if they violate civil rights. So this is saying there's no link from the negative's uniqueness to the world of passing the affirmative. It's not an overreach because the federal government already has this power. So if the federal government through the 14th Amendment says that the national government has the power to make police do these changes, then it's not an overreach, right? It's a power that they already have. So therefore, if it's not an overreach, if it doesn't imbalance the power, then the impacts won't happen because it won't change the status quo, right? It won't change the uniqueness the way the world is right now. So I think that's a good argument. I think it's a pretty good argument for the affirmative. The next piece of affirmative evidence is from Matthew Plat in 2020. It just says that in the past, when the national government has had these overreaches, it's had no impact on the balance of federalism. And federalism is, it's just a fancy $10 word that is the same thing as saying the balance between the national and the state governments. So in the past, when the federal government has overreached on these issues before, it hasn't really had any impact. So if that's been true in the past, why wouldn't it be true now? Even if it is an overreach, it's not enough to cause the impacts. So therefore, there's no link between what the affirmative is doing and the world that the negative is talking about here. And this card has some really good examples from the past. I would read all of it, not just the non-underlined parts, to get a sense of what it's talking about, and then decide which parts you think make the most sense. Okay, third link card is that many of the firearms the affirmative will get rid of are actually being provided by the federal government, so the plan is not an overreach by the federal government. This is a tricky argument right here. So this is Owens, Clark, and Glynn 2020. Basically, this talks about a program called the 1033 program. 1033 program is a federal program that gives surplus firearms from the military to local governments. And that is where the local governments get most of their firearms from. So the logic behind this card is if it's the federal government giving these states and cities their guns and they just stop doing that, that's not an overreach of their power, right? Because it's a federal government that's already providing the guns themselves. So if they stop, it's not like they're, encroaching on state power or local power. They're just stopping a federal program that already exists. I think that's a good argument. Okay, so those are the links. Now we get to the impact. You're going to notice these impact arguments are a little bit different. They are turns rather than defense. So the uniqueness in the link so far is defense. It's just been saying, no. The negative is wrong here. We don't really change anything. Like their story's not really true. We don't agree with it, but there's no real impact to it, right? So now the arguments are going to become something more like, no, we agree. We change the relationship between the national and the local governments, but that's a good thing and it should happen. So these are what the impact turns are going to say. And as we talk about in the next video, you can't really read the uniqueness and link answers and also read the impact answers. So you're going to have to choose as the affirmative what your strategy is. Do you want to say non-unique, no link, or do you want to say impact turn? So first impact turn card is from Michael Harriot, 2016. A little bit old, but this is another historical example argument, right? So if it's a historical example argument, doesn't need to be super fresh and clean and recent. So this one says that state power is bad because states' rights arguments have traditionally been used to protect racist policies. And this is an interestingly written card. It's more fun to read than most of the other cards, but it has good data, good examples, and good claims, right? Basically just says every time people try to bring up the fact that the state should have more power, it's almost always done to the end of saying, states should be allowed to have these racist policies or these harmful policies. And so therefore, if the states have too much power, they're going to continue using that line of thought to have more racist policies, more bad policies, and only the national government has been the one to step in and tell them, no, like you have to integrate schools, you have to not have slavery anymore, you have to, stop redlining, you have to stop doing this stuff. It's not the states or the local governments who did those good things. It was the federal government that made them do a lot of those progressive policies. Next one is an impact turn from Michael Livermore. He says that state governments will fail to stop climate change. Only the federal government has broad and unifying power to stop it. So it looks back on Obama's time, and it talks about, climate change being this pretty big, difficult issue, right? And basically he says, if we leave it up to the states, some states will do a good job, but some states will do a really bad job. And as long as we have states who do a really bad job, we're never going to solve this problem of climate change. Only the federal government has the power to unify all the states and make international treaties, which is what it's going to take to actually solve the problem of climate change. So this is a good argument. This is a good answer to the other climate change argument. And remember, the way we get from the plan to here is that the negative is saying that when we take power away from the criminal justice sector, it affects all of these other areas. So that's saying, okay, well, if that's true, then you're taking away power from, it's important for the national government to have power and states not to have power if we want to solve climate change, right? So it's a turn. It's a reason why doing the plan's a good idea, because it takes power away from the states, gives it to the national government. Okay, second to last impact turn here. Or is this the last one? This is the last one. Wow, here we are. So this impact turn says that more local authority creates a race to the bottom, which harms the people who live in those states. Only the federal government can create regulations that help everyone, set a floor to governments. So this is Richard Florida, 2018. He gives the example of the Amazon headquarters that was going to be built in 2018. And basically what happened was Amazon was like, all right, we want to build this second headquarters and shipping center. And it's going to create all these jobs. It's going to create all this economic revenue for, whatever city or state it's in. So, hey, different states and cities, what can you give us if we decide to build this wherever you are? And what happened as a result of that is that a bunch of cities and states basically kept saying they would give more and more and more. Like, oh, we won't tax you for 20 years. We'll have lax labor laws. We'll give you shipping rate discounts, stuff like this, all this stuff that's like, at a certain point, it's good because you want Amazon to come to where you are and give you all those jobs and all that economic activity. But eventually it's not very good, right? Because you have to give up so much to get them to come to your city or your state. That's actually going to be a net negative. And the argument that Richard Florida is making here is that basically when you have states compete like this, it makes them race to the bottom, right? It makes them have the worst possible scenario for the people who live there so that they can get, like state businesses or whatever to be there. And another example he gives is about pollution, right? So let's say, in Minnesota, we have 5 or 6 neighboring states, right? So what if our pollution laws are really strict? Like you can't hardly pollute, you can't have air pollution, can't have water pollution, can't have soil pollution. We have really high standards. What are businesses in our state going to do who would otherwise be doing pollution, right? They're going to move to other states. They're going to move to like the Dakotas or Wisconsin, Iowa, whatever, wherever there's states nearby that are going to allow them to do their business at the lowest price possible so that they can have the highest profit possible. So the problem is if you're a state like Minnesota and you have those high standards, you're going to lose a bunch of business and stuff. People are going to move away. You're not going to have anything left. So you're not going to have any taxes. You can't do anything, right? So it creates this bad system where the states with the most lax, the lowest regulations are the ones that are going to get all the business, all the income, all the people coming there to do business. And that's really bad, right? So in general, when you do that in every state, because every state has to decrease their regulations and things like that. So Richard Florida says basically the only way to stop that problem is to have a national government that sets a standard baseline, right? So when you think about like minimum wage is something that a lot of national has a lot of play between national and state governments, right? So if the federal minimum is $15, then it doesn't matter where you live, you're going to be paid $15 no matter what, right? But as it is right now, it's quite a bit lower than that. So only states that want to do better have to do better. And as a result, a lot of states have the lowest possible minimum wage at a lot of jobs. And that's very harmful. It's very difficult for a lot of people who live there, right? You might ask, why don't people just leave that state to go somewhere where there's a higher minimum wage? And that's a complicated question because if you have more people come in, you have a bigger labor pool, you can pay them less. So that might not actually work out. And also, if you're making minimum wage, you probably don't have enough money to move somewhere else, right? So you might not really have a choice for what you're getting paid if you're working a job at that skill or that demand level. So obviously, I've been talking about this card for a long time. So it's a little bit of a complicated argument, but I do think it's a really strong argument. So if it's true that there's spillover to other cases, to other places, then leaving this up to the states is not a very good idea because it's going to decrease the good results for everybody in a lot of different ways. Okay, so this is a pretty long video. This is going to be a long video. That's fine. I hope you listen to all this, but you don't necessarily have to. There's going to be timestamps for everything if you want to go back and look at uniqueness, impact, whatever arguments. But I seriously think you should read through this argument explanation above and then find one piece of evidence at each different type of argument, like uniqueness, link, impact, and decide what makes the most sense to you when you're planning about how to answer the disad or how you want to run the disad when you're on the negative or the affirmative. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have questions, you should definitely ask your partner and your coach. But otherwise, just keep reading the evidence, keep trying it out at the debates, and see how it goes for you. Enjoy and have fun.